So, so I'm very pleased to introduce Paige West from Columbia University and Barnard College. She'll be telling us about the keyword of multi-species studies, letter S for spectacular.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you all for watching this. This is the first time I've ever done anything like this on the internet, so I find it quite interesting and a little daunting. So the first part is called What Is? The term spectacular has traditionally been used to describe the alienation of signs and meanings from reality under capitalism. I suggest in this essay that its etymology points the way to reclaim capitalism's use of images of plants, animals, peoples, and their intertwinings. To rethink spectacular in our multi-species worlding, we must begin with the spectacle. In the terms defined by the situationalists, spectacle means, simply put, the mediation of all social relations by images produced in order to generate capital by selling commodities. They were intellectuals, experimental artists, and political theorists who formed a collective in 1957 that was strongly influenced by certain forms of Marxism and Marxist thought, the avant-garde art movement, and surrealism. They worked with Marx's ideas about alienation, fetishism, and commodities, seeing these things intertwined with every aspect of modern life. They saw a world where all social relations were formed over and expressed through objects, and where commodity consumption had begun to erase real human experience and real human desires, and they connected all of this to the emergence of mass-mediated images. The idea of the spectacle was a key part of their intellectual work. It was the enemy. In the Society of Spectacles, the author argues that commodities have come to value not because of their material attributes or the labor that went into the production, but rather because of the abstract images associated with them, and that economy as a whole had become one of spectacle. With this, the author describes an economy based on the exchange of signs, symbols, and images, at least as much as it's based on the actual exchange of objects. In this spectacular economy, we come to rely on images instead of taking the time to learn about the commodities we're buying, or the social and material relations that bring us the commodities. These images promise more than a commodity can ever offer, and they replace reality in a kind of fantasy world that guides our intellectual, our material, and our aesthetic relations with everything, including politics. These fantasy worlds might offer the promise of a thin body or a perfect head of hair, or even a beautiful world full of happy people and healthy animals. And I just urge people to click on the link right after that part in the written version of this. It's quite interesting. Spectacles, understood this way, make us feel. They make us desire, make us have bodily feelings that then structure how we perceive and act in the world. Susan Buck-Morss argues that the commodities that circulate in the spectacular economy allow us to imagine a better life than the one we have, while at the same time blocking out and dulling our experience of the life we're currently living. In some of my work, I've shown that the images used to sell products, like coffee, for example, work to make us feel like our consumption can make the lives of other people better, as well as providing a future for our planet that's better for both people and other species. Images of indigenous people and the often beautiful places in our world where they live are used to make consumers feel both connected to these people and places, as if they're directly contributing to the assumed local desire to live in traditional ways. Dan Brockington and some of his colleagues have argued, using the same logic of the spectacular economy, that mainstream environmental conservation uses images of nature to sell both environmental campaigns and various commodities. They argue that this process hollows out the meaning of nature being used, and in some efforts to conserve the natural have made it so that humans associate some disaggregate bits of the world with commodities, celebrities, or experiences, and conservation organizations have used these connections as a vehicle for accumulation. And I'm also referencing here the wonderful new work of Molly Doan on conservation and accumulation. The images in this spectacular economy today are part of a capitalism with extraordinary velocity. The rate of turnover for images and marketing campaigns in contemporary advertising and contemporary conservation is astounding. Images that were connected to a commodity or campaign yesterday may well detract from its value today. Marketers and public relations experts plan on a kind of obsolescence of images or signs. Capitalism today depends on a velocity of sign value. so that even if products don't change, their value can be increased by changing their appearance of value. When the goal becomes a rapid turnover of capital and overcoming barriers to capital, and a commodity's meanings and values are tied to semiotics, there's also a rapid turnover of meanings. And the meanings, images, and values used to sell commodities can and will be thrown away once they no longer carry marketplace value. Once a meaning stops having value in the marketplace, the people who want to sell the object must immediately find new meaning to pour into it or to wrap it up in. This rapid turnover of images means that the discarded images are seen as lacking value. They're seen as disposable. And all of this means that in the spectacular economy, where images of indigenous peoples, as well as images of plants, animals, and ecosystems are used to sell, images of our multi-species world are disposed of after the supposed value has been wrung out of them. Part 2, what could be? In its life before the Situationist, and those of us influenced in our thinking and writing by them, made its way into our understanding of capital, mass-mediated images, and social dislocations, spectacle meant something extraordinary that attracts attention and both catches the eye and impresses. And here I have a section about turning to the Latin origins and the Greek origins, and I'm not going to try to speak Latin or Greek, but I'll just tell you what the last part of the paper is about. I draw the connections between the history of the word spectacle and spectacular and go back to one of the earlier meanings of the word see and connect spectacle and spectacular to the English word species. And I show that at its roots, deep in the history of utterances, spectacle connects to species. And what I want to suggest is if we started to reclaim the idea of the spectacular from corporations, from marketers, from big conservation, from capitalism perhaps, that if we went back to this kind of linguistic root of the term and we decided to see every species intersection as spectacular, as something extraordinary to behold, that we might actually do something to encourage more multi-species worlding and to encourage a better world for all of us. And my sense and part of the multi-species project, although I know it is multivariate, is that it wants to revive the wonder in our world through understanding processes, political, social, historical, and other, that worked to convince us a very long time ago that nature was somehow distinct from culture. And I think this idea of the new spectacular can help us do that. That is all.
Thanks, Paige. So there's a way that both you and Luis Vivianco have described spectacular birds and the roles that they play in conservation projects. So I think the conventional way that conservationists have of talking about these animals is as flagship species or umbrella species by raising a lot of money for a particular kind of critter that captures people's attention. It gives money for other communities. But you know, one of the fundamental insights of this idea from Debord of spectacle is the misplaced concreteness. And I was wondering if you could tell us a bit from some of the stuff you've written in Conservation is Our Government Now about the misplaced concretenesses that are happening around birds in the highlands of Papua New Guinea.
So highlands of Papua New Guinea and actually northern Queensland, Australia, and some parts of Indonesia are home to a kind of bird that they're called birds of paradise, and they are quite truly the most extraordinary birds that I have ever seen. And they're also birds that are part of an extraordinary complex that is one of the most interesting examples of socio-natural connections. Many of the indigenous groups who live in the highlands of Papua New Guinea take these birds and incorporate them into their traditional ontology and epistemology and draw meaning from the birds, draw understandings about gender relationships from the birds, and really this kind of marriage of humans and other species we can see really beautiful in people's relationships with birds of paradise. One of the things that I think happens when these birds become disarticulated from these relationships that they've had with humans for an extremely long time is that the idea of value comes in, And conservationists talk about people coming to value these birds, both Western donors who give money to conservation organizations, and then also indigenous people who inhabit the same ecosystems as these birds. And what that idea of value does is it erases something that is a much more affective relationship with those animals that people have, which is not about the Western notion of value at all, which I think is tied back to that spectacular economy of capitalism, but rather is about kinship. You know, the people that I work with in the Eastern Highlands of Papua New Guinea in the Lufa district, Gimi speakers, have a couple of concepts that are incredibly important for this, and one of them is their concept of auna, and that's the sort of life force that a person has, what is in you, what animates you. And there's a deep connection between that life force when it leaves your body upon death and goes back to your clan's land and infuses in all of the plants and animals and birds and rivers and everything. And a good person to read on this, in addition to me, is the brilliant Gillian Gillison. There's the sense that that human essence bleeds into the forest upon death, and then through hunting and through being in the forest, people pick up that auna of their ancestors and ingest it through eating animals, wear it in things, adornment things made out of bird feathers. And so that much more effective historical kinship relationship is elided when we talk about value. And I think that's what happens with this kind of concrete process that you're asking about.
Hmm. Do you want to jump in, anyone? I've got more things to say.
One's hatching, but it's not quite here yet.
So while that question's hatching, maybe I'll just do a plug for one of the essays in the book. And one of the essays, Life in the Age of Biotechnology, takes this same sort of logic of spectacle and uses it to look at multi-species relationships that we take for granted that sort of allow us to lead the lives we lead right now with biomedicine. So what we're trying to explore is the same sort of labor relations that Marx talks about in terms of the production of the economy, or sorry, of the commodity that Debord talks about in the production of spectacular images, to think about how human bodies are produced and how we've become dependent on all these unseen laboratory laborers, what Adam Zaretsky, a bioartist, characterizes as the workhorse zoo. So that's just a plug for one of the essays in the Multi-Species Salon book that tries to use this logic of spectacle in a multi-species frame that is about these cyborg articulations and relations and biocommodities marketplaces. Do you have a question?
I love that idea. I love that idea of thinking about all the labor that goes into making human bodies that we never think about, and I do think that's one bit of the kind of commodity chain and relations of production that we don't think about nearly as much as we should. And that essay, which I have not read, which I will go read right now, that essay fits so nicely with some of the earlier work that I know you all were doing, and kind of the thought experiments of looking at the ecologists and biologists who are thinking about the creatures that live in our human bodies and that make us so much more than an individual species. So there's this nice articulation between the discussion about labor and cyborg workers and human bodies as so much more and less than human.
So my slightly still unhatched question, Paige, is, first of all, thank you so much for that. That was really helpful and super interesting. And especially the idea that I do think I've seen a similar thing in my experience too, where like a lot of the way that we see the world is kind of through this spectacular and this competition for more spectaculars to kind of catch our attention, whether, through capitalism and in the everyday. And I guess I'm really interested in non-spectacular possibilities of kind of drawing our attention, or ways that, that might compete with those kind of capitalist spectaculars. And I guess I'm thinking too about, hedgehog conservation in Britain, where a lot of the argument, or especially around Hugh Warwick's work, is saying that the hedgehog is it's a little brown, funny, sure, it's charismatic, but it's in your backyard, it's kind of pottering through, and so that hedgehog care in some ways is quite unspectacular, maybe, and at least in a capitalist sense. There's not, of course, it's not mediated by kind of cultural ideas of charisma. But I just wondered if you could speak a little bit more about ways in which we can maybe counter or work against capitalist spectaculars. It's not very often.
This is going to seem strange because I'm not really a person that talks about children very often, because I do not have them. I'm not very good with them. But I was thinking today about a young friend of mine in Papua New Guinea. His father, John Iney, is my research partner there, and his son, Maya Iney, just sent me an email via his father about his grades for term. He did very, very well. He's a genius child. And, you know, I was thinking about him in relation to our conversation and to the spectacular. And so they live on New Ireland, which is a big island off the north coast of Papua New Guinea. And the reef system there is probably the most biologically diverse spot on our planet. It's just incredible. It's in the Western Pacific Warm Pool. It's part of what's been constructed as the Coral Triangle, although I think that is a sort of spectacular branding thing that was done by conservation. But anyway, so Maya Iney, every single day that I am there, and I'm usually there June and July and part of August, every single day that I am there, he is out on the beach if he's not in school, looking at things and doing things like playing with an octopus, something as simple as a little tiny octopus, or something even more simple as a little non-poisonous cone shell. And there is a kind of wonder and joy that he feels with that creature, and in his interactions with it, and in the social relations that it moves through as he shows it to his friends, as he brings it to my house to show it to me, as he shows it to his dad or his siblings. And there's something about that kind of, again, for lack of a better term, that wonder that we can feel when we see something that is not charismatic megafauna. You know, I mean, I like whale sharks as much as the next person and would love to hang out with them. But I think the hedgehog, I mean, think about the hedgehog. Think about feeling it. It's pointy little porcupine-esque little quills, and its pointy nose, and the way it rolls up in a ball, and the way that when you see it in the ball you can't quite figure out what it is, and how it feels in your hand, and then all of the extraordinary things it does, and the fact that it is in your backyard. You know, that's amazing. And that's, I think, what kind of getting the spectacular back to a pre-capitalized understanding, I think that's what I'm pushing towards.
I think I could add something. I've just been thinking about that page. It's really interesting that the anti-spectacular ethic might be staying with the thing, staying with the image, as opposed to what you were saying earlier of that around the temporality of the spectacle in the economy of the spectacle. That it's a fantasy projection into a near future, and it's always recycling rapidly. But then maybe to stay with an image and be linger with it, or with the object that is supposedly spectacular, doesn't diminish its beauty or whatever, but it somehow it doesn't allow that rapid recycling and re-entering of that image into another economy, another range of values. Right. So that, I guess, why the bird of paradise doesn't change its feathers.
Right. Well, and I'm thinking about your work that you just told me about, you know, looking at the way that some scientists are thinking about particular kinds of species versus people who have these affective relationships with them. And it makes me think about, and you know, some of my scientist friends who work on particular species or particular taxa their entire career, they do the best work in the world. And so this is not a critique, but it's meant to help us maybe broaden out how we think about the study of animals and its value. And I think this is, you know, very much a part of the multi-species project. You know, I'm thinking about the way in which when an animal or a species or a taxa comes under strict scientific scrutiny, that there's a standardization of that creature, right? We want to know certain things about it, about its behavior, and I know that, you know, lots of people have written about this, but I think that we're in a moment now, especially with the numbers that have just come out today in Nature of the number of species that are going to be extinct in the next 100 years. I think we're at a moment, we're at a kind of watershed moment where we can say, okay, sure, we definitely need more science about these creatures, but what else do we need? What do we need to help people understand why they're important in the world? And this makes me think a little bit about the importance of environmental humanities and people that are writing about, you know, writing poetry about animals. And that makes me think about Mary Oliver, who her poetry is some of the most gorgeous work about North American animals and the multi-species relationships that envelop them that you will ever see.
So one of the bioartists featured in the Life in the Age of Biotechnology essay, Adam Zaretsky, describes his work as spectacular warfare. He describes his bioart projects as turning the logic of the spectacle against itself. And I think maybe in contrast to that spectacular warfare, I think what a lot of ethnographers are doing these days are sticking with the unloved others, doing the very careful, patient work to both look at who's excluded from these conservation projects, who's excluded from the known world. You know, Jeff Boker's done really great accounting of memory practices in the sciences and who falls out of the taxonomic work. But I think at the same time, there might be a moment for that spectacular warfare in you know, a concrete effort to make a particular critter visible, knowable, intelligible, to bring it from the realm of zoo, bear life, to the realm of bios with a biographical and biopolitical life. So yeah, I see like all these beautiful images that are proliferating on the internet of certain kinds of microbes, of insects. Alex Wild is an amazing photographer who makes imperceptible things perceptible by taking up close pictures of these colorful critters that otherwise are disregarded. So it seems like on the same time that many ethnographers are working in the shadows of the spectacle, trying to uncover what isn't otherwise being talked about. Maybe to use Bourdieu, looking at what's the sort of the universe of discourse, how orthodoxy and heterodoxy obscure this realm of the undiscussed. I think a lot of us are trying to delve into that realm of the undiscussed, but there might be moments where we want to join Adam Zaretsky in his spectacular warfare and propel things into that universe of discourse.
I think that sounds good, but I missed about 3/4 of it because I got frozen up and I couldn't hear you.
Okay. I think the spectacle is working against us right now. I think Google is figuring out that we're being subversive here. And any more thoughts before we wrap up?
Yeah, another question. Just was really struck, Paige, by you're talking about the idea of standardization of species, and I also just thought about, you know, standardization that happens through the spectacular, where, you know, we're encouraged, you know, to maybe relate to whatever we're being called to, whether it's a coffee or to whatever critter it is that is seen to be in need of conservation. That is kind of a standardization in the call, in how we're called to relate or to act. And in your story about, you know, the wonder of this genius boy as he's hanging out with all of these different sea critters, I mean, there's something so beautiful and non-standard about this. You know, he's actually able to, yeah, to meet this octopus or whoever it is, and kind of see what happens. And I was just wondering if you could riff a bit more on that.
Sure. I mean, it actually, I think that I've been thinking about that sort of thing a little bit with regard to some of the new and interesting work on ontology in anthropology, and particularly the way that multi-species relationships are articulated through that work. And I think there's something extraordinary about, is it explicating or excavating? I can never remember which word. We don't explain, we explicate.
Mm-hmm.
Is it that, you know, there's something amazing
You got it.
about explicating a philosophy of or in or around jaguars. But there's also something extraordinary about the ethnographic apprehension of one relationship between one human being and one jaguar. So a story about someone's experience with a creature of some kind. And so I think that there is a place for both within anthropology, but I'm sort of thinking a lot about the you know, the work of people like Danielle Divanelli-Lang, who I mentioned to you all earlier, who does this extraordinary work on the relationships between people in Southeast Alaska and the many animals that populate their history, their memory, the same spaces that they do. And there's always a way in which she moves between a very clear understanding of Tlingit philosophies about and of animals and individual affective relationships, and the way that the state attempts to bridge or bound or control those relationships. And so I guess that's what your comment makes me think about, that kind of work that in some ways does it all.
Awesome. Thanks.
Well, I just want to thank you so much, Paige, for taking the time to share your words with us. It truly is a spectacular entry, both in a literal and figurative sense, and undermines the spectacle at the same time that it is spectacular. So thank you very much, and yeah, looking forward to seeing more of you soon.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me to do this, and you all have a lovely day, and I'll sign off. Bye.